Morning. My name's John McKay, and what we're going to be speaking about today is testing from farm to pharmacy. So it's really looking at the overall process of when you test and what you test and how the testing of different cannabinoids and other material is done within the hemp industry. So appreciate you for coming and thank the CBD Expo for inviting me and having to do this presentation today and see how far we can get during this time, and be sure and ask questions. Doing. And it's also what do I need to test and when do I need to test and how often do I need to test to really make some changes within your process or when you're looking for things that you have to make sure that the potency is correct on a formulation. And then what kind of key compounds are being manufactured. And so that talks more towards formulation-centric. And when you're looking at formulation-centric processes, you're starting with the type of compound that you're wanting to make. And then from that type of compound, you're being able to know what kind of extraction process you have and how you're going to get those ingredients. And then we'll dive a little deeper into the overall process. So when I look at the best way to extract processes and hemp, it moves towards what am I actually trying to get out. And so the concentration's a mixture of separation and extraction steps. How does it impact on each one of these? And then prioritizing your processes based on what I call the 4 S's. And the 4 S's that I like to talk about are selectivity, scalability, speed, and how much you're investing into that process, which is spend. And cleverly enough, I put the $ onto the S. The other one that I want to make sure that we emphasize throughout the process is good is not a number. So analytics are critical to the success of every single hemp manufacturer, and no matter which process and part you're on, whether you're starting from the plant or whether you're starting from a concentrated mixture, both of those processes in place are critical to what you have to have and where you're going to measure those. I work with a lot of different corporations. I got a PhD out of the University of Vermont in synthetic chemistry. I spent 29 years at Waters Corporation after teaching at a few colleges. And then from there, I retired in 2017 and started up my own business called Synergistic Technologies Associates. And within that technology, being able to help people through Six Sigma as well as understanding the cannabis plant to be able to know and help them out for as they're entering the business or if they're in the business, and then helping perfect their processes. So for example, I work with brands such as Hybrid Technology, Spectrum, Evolution, and they build ethanol containers that go through the entire process. Evolution builds out entire facilities, and then ICC Group does a lot of different things with wineries and beer, as well as on the hemp side of the business. Another one I work with is Thar Processing. They work with extraction and purification. So within that process, being able to have smaller extractors, whether it's for the hemp or whether it's for cannabis, moving to large extractors all the way to 1,625 liters. And also on the purification side, moving from small scale all the way to very large scale, and we'll talk about some of those. I also work with a company that deals with the smaller side of the extraction, and whether it's medicinal chemistry or whether it's hemp or whether it's other products that move through the cannabis world. making sure it's pure, making sure you have a smaller scale for pilot size projects. Another one working through is a company called Kinja out of Fort Collins, Colorado. They're building, again, more of a pilot size for the hemp world, but also something that would be allowing them to certainly make headway into the connoisseur group within cannabis, making specialty products through CO2 extraction and CO2 with a co-solvent, for example, of ethanol. So I like to start off with some of the talks with looking at cannabis. And I always put this slide up, but I also always amend people to the fact that it is a joke. So before I even talk about that, a lot of people will come up afterwards and want to know, how do I get a hold of this system? And so I do put this slide up as a warning that it really is a joke. So this is the automated Botanical Concentrator. And I like to say it's as easy as ABC. So within that, you just ask it for what you're trying to get. You're just wanting to do an automatic concentration, so you're going to ask it for CBD or THC or CBDA or some sort of terpene. So a lot of people look at it as a magic box. They really believe that this type of technology is available, and it's not. So when I'm looking at the type of moderation and looking at the type of work that we do for monitoring things, a lot of us have products on us or products that we use through an app so that we're monitoring our heart rate during a run. We're working, it follows us. We're on a GPS. It knows where we go. It's monitoring our sleep. It's monitoring our rest. And we take these things seriously, but you still could do that by just, having a chance of just taking your pulse on your wrist. But because we've moved towards that technology from a pulse on our wrist to things that are apps that are on our phone and on our wrist, as a watch, we've gotten used to those. And so when I'm looking at things like this, I'm looking at, the time of day and the progress and, where did I go and what did I do and as well as, for sleep, did I sleep well? Did I wake up 2 or 3 times? And that's the same thing as monitoring, but then we move it towards hemp, or we move it towards potency of formulations that we're making, and suddenly we have a different thought process. But the thought process still has to be the same. You need to be able to know what you're doing through the entire process, the same way that you're measuring your last run or your last bike ride. This is a paper that just came out. It's now mid-December of 2020, and this paper was just coming out today. And so I put it up here. It's a regulatory sampling of industrial hemp plant samples using UPLC, MSMS for the detection and quantitation of 12 cannabinoids. And within this process, this is a system that would be a little too expensive for your first run, but as you're looking at the chromatograms and the different things that you can see, you can tell that even running through the standards, that's where you have your known concentration of compounds. You walk through the standards, and then you run a sample, and you can see that not all those peaks are coming out at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit about this chromatography and how you get to these things. But this is the overall process of something we're trying to get to, and then we'll show step by step on what this means and why it's pertinent. So a couple things. When I'm looking at the application space for cannabis, and I see that there's lots of challenges, but for 80, 100 years, it's been more of subjective testing. And certainly with the subjective testing, because it wasn't legal in the United States, it didn't mean that they still weren't growing plants and people still weren't using them and medicating. But most of the time, it's been what I call sin-centric. And that is that you're smelling it, you're tasting it, you're having a feeling. And so each one of those is a sin-centric, and that's not really exactly quantitative, qualitative, analytical chemistry. The other one that I see out there is the University of YouTube and other social media. And so you gain a lot of thought process on how do I make an oil? How do I make a flour? How do I make different formulations? And so each one of those comes up from the YouTube, and it's not the most analytical chemistry either. And then we have underground textbooks. So textbooks as far as, someone writing something down and then passing it through, whether how they make a different product or what a different variety of cannabis or hemp brings them. And so all 3 of those are not consistent. The other challenges we have is we have inconsistent local regulations. So it doesn't matter if you're in Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Vermont, Massachusetts, California, name a state, and they all have a different regulation, and they also all have a different part that they're looking at or wanting to enforce or what they think is most important to them. We also have suspect results from independent labs, which I would say undermines the need for advocates in in-house testing, because people will talk about sending multiple samples to a lab and they all get a different result, or they send the exact same sample and they get what they would see as widely disparate results. And so why would they invest in a tool when an ROI is, just as good from a subjective view? And that's not irrelevant. So we will talk about how to move forward with that. So as I'm progressing through this and I talk about the understanding, again, good is not a number. And that's the criteria for many things that we're talking about on the testing, because people say it's good enough, oh, look, it looks yellow, or it looks like this, or it smells like that, and so it must be a good product. And neither of those have anything to do with actual chemistry, nor what's in the chemicals involved. So this is really good. So to amount of components in a mixture, and so testing is more about an amount. So you have CBD of 10%, CBDA of 6%, CBGA 2%. You put percentage numbers on that. But the key to this is if you have 2,395 grams of material, you take the percentage and you know how many grams of actual compound that is based on the percentage. Remembering percentage is a unitless number. And so what you really want to do is you want to know how many potential grams are in that sample. So if this was 2,395 grams of a flower, or 2,395 grams of a leaf, it doesn't matter. You still want to know what's in what's that potential. It was really much faster this time. And so asking people about an extraction doesn't matter what the media for the extraction is. Going faster has nothing to do with what you're having for yield. Rate is not much faster. So in that type of time, you're looking at milligrams per minute, so you could be testing and recording the amount of material made per specific amount of time. The same way that you would measure your rate of how you're going on a highway from Houston to Dallas. I mean, how many miles did you go, and how long did it take you to get there is a rate. So stage one in a CO2 extraction, you might be at 80 bar, you might be at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and 10 grams every minute were being totally extracted. In stage two, you might be bringing the temperature up to 90 degrees, and you find out that you're getting a faster extraction by a rate of grams per minute. But again, you have to be able to measure that every minute to know how many grams you're actually getting to be able to make that decision. The same way that you have to be able to know how many miles you went between Houston and Dallas at the different points and stops that you would make, you would know that you were going faster at one point. So I am guessing that if you came out of downtown Houston, it's going to be very different than once you get on the highway, that your rate during that first part while you're traveling through the Houston roads trying to get to the highway, that's a slower rate. You've got stoplights, you have people, and you move towards the highway, and now you have less time and less people, but you'll still have some backups at different times, and that will change also. We got a lot this time. I hear this a lot. I hear this many times from people of, oh, we got more. You got more of what? And so to have yield and mass balancing, you want to test the results of the starting material and what's ending, because you might get 5 pounds of starting material and 430 grams of yield, but it might be just 68% of total cannabinoids. And so if you have a different percentage of the cannabinoids that are in that oil or in that total mixture, that still gives you something that has not a lot more. You might have gotten other compounds that add on to that. And so those are some of the things that we need to explore as we're talking about analytical data and working through the hemp world. Typically, when we're working through natural products, and there's a lot of natural products that we use every single day, black cohosh, we're using melatonin, we're using lavender, we're using a lot of different natural products in our world. And so when you're going through that process, typically what happens is they do a purification of that product, whether it's a plant or whether it's an animal, and you go back through and you test it. And so from that, you figure out all the different components that are in that, and then from there you do ingredient profiling, and you start to make products, and then you do quality control, because once you have a product and you have a definition of what that product is, then you're going back through and you're making sure that you can make it time and time again, the exact same product, the same way that you go to a fast food restaurant and you're expecting that what you order, you're going to have the same taste and flavor if you're in Houston or you're in Dallas or you're in Chicago or Boston. Each one of those places, you're expecting to have the same experience no matter where you are. And then you go to the post-market and making sure you have shelf life and making sure that you're qualified and customers are happy. And from there, you're able to know, did I make the same product? And what's happened through the hemp world is that we bypass most of those steps in the beginning and already we're making products. So that's why we're sometimes in a disarray, is because we move too far forward. I sometimes like to say that the horse, the cart isn't so much in front of the horse, but the horse hasn't even been born yet. And so when you look at that process, you now say, we're too far ahead. And so that's why we're doing so much backtracking. It seems like we're going back and forth, and that's because there is a bit of confusion on where we are in a typical process. So when I look at hemp versus marijuana, there's lots of terms that are being used. There's lots of things that happen through the process, who's naming what. They like to name things. Marijuana, if it's greater than 0.3% THC, and they make that separate from hemp. Both of those nomenclatures are the cannabis. It's a cannabis plant with a different expression of those components that are in it and the biosynthesis from the plant. It has nothing to do with what the United States government or anyone else has, no matter where they are, UN, about what those plants' differentiation. The differentiation is based on what you're trying to get for the amount of CBDA versus the amount of THCA, which are two components that the plant biosynthesis makes. So when we look at that and we think about that, the plant's not making THC or it's not making CBD or CBG. It actually makes them in an acid form. There's a full complex biosynthesis that the plant goes through, and as you can see from the CBGA, it can degrade and lose an acid. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And we also have CBDA going to CBD, THCA going to THC. But what happens through that process from the CBGA is it goes through another compound that's called, for example, CBDA synthase. And the synthase is what is coming from the CBGA. And so when you have CBGA and you go to THCA, you have THCA synthase. And so the entire process, as you're moving through that, has the ability of knowing what you have for acids versus what you have for neutrals. When you're looking at the entire guidelines, you're looking at the guidelines of the overall process, and that is being able to know that there is going to be a process once the U.S. government has a federal law. And the best one that I've found is to have the botanical drug development. It's a guidance for the industry for the botanical and natural and nutritional dietary supplements. So if you're looking for something where the market is going, this would be the one that I would encourage you to read. And this isn't the only product that's out there. So when you're doing bitters were something that was being used for pharmaceutical. And these are the same sort of things that are extracted. You'll see the same sort of limonene, linalool, you'll see myrcene, you'll see the same sort of compounds that you typically see in a bitter. And the same thing happens when you're looking at daffodils. And so a lot of people don't know that daffodils, it depends on what else is put into that vase. Because at the same time you're having affected flowers, you will have things that will kill them and things that will make them better. For example, roses and tulips will kill daffodils through two different processes. One goes through a process where it actually makes something that's a poison that comes into the daffodil, poison to the daffodil, not to the other flower. And the other one will coagulate with sugars, and that will clog up the bottom. It doesn't get any water, and so now it dies. So plants are very complex, and there's many of them in many different varieties, and that's why you have to have the quantitative and qualitative work that has to be done on hemp. There's many compounds within a cannabis plant, and remembering that cannabis, hemp and marijuana, whatever you want to call them, it depends on the percentage of those two cannabinoids, but there's a lot of other cannabinoids that are synthesized and degraded during that process. There's also a process where there's a number of different isomers. So because these molecules also have the same molecular weight, there'll be other isomers. For example, CBD has probably 7 to 8 isomers. And so when you look at that process, it's also knowing that the plant is making a multitude of compounds that we like to call CBDA for short, because there's minus CBDA and minus plus CBDA. There's a lot of different components that happen through that process, and so knowing where the purity of them are. When I'm looking at cannabis and synthetic cannabinoids, it's not so much that people are starting from scratch, though you can do that as a synthetic chemist. You can make these products, but it's a very arduous and it's a very expensive process. But when you look at the other compounds that can be done synthetic cannabinoids means it's something that the plant didn't make on its own. There's a lot of more emphasis on things such as CBN. CBN is not made by the plant. It's a synthetic cannabinoid because it's been through a degradation product. Delta-8 THC is another product that is made through the process and made through the degradation cycle. So these other products can also be in that mixture, and so as you're doing an extraction or as you're doing a formulation, you can inadvertently make these other compounds, and that's why testing is important to have in your facility. So the natural products, there's a lot of them out there, and some of the ones that we're currently using. So we have the Pacific yew tree, that's Taxol. We have the willow bark, and now we have aspirin. And we're not cutting down willow bark trees to go make aspirin. That was finally made into a small molecule. And so when you're looking at each one of these processes, you're also seeing that it's at a point in time that you're going to have small molecules of what the cannabinoids are, or variations of them. So what are you expecting to do when you leave the session? So giving you a little bit of time to think about it. And so usually I put the slide in just to help out as you're thinking about, what do I really want to get out of this session? Is it just more informational? Am I trying to make a decision on whether I should even get into the industry? Each one of those questions is a positive one, and we can make sure and come back to those after the break. Hidden fears and voices. I don't like science. I didn't like science in high school, and there's no reason for me to believe that that will change today. This is typically the one that's involved with that whether I'm working with customers, and that is making sure that they feel comfortable. Just because you didn't like science then doesn't mean that science can't be fun. But a lot of times if you get into the narrow detail and you think about, why am I even learning any of this stuff, it's okay. I love everything about chemistry, plant science, physics, and the applied chemical engineering and process control. And these people are typically the ones looking at the other people from the first one, and that is, why are these stupid questions coming from people who shouldn't even be thinking that they should be breathing my air? Both of those processes are in place, and both of those people are in the room. So just be kind to each other. The other one I typically have is having the following statement is, I know this is a dumb question, but there are no dumb questions. And so I taught small college and larger schools, and probably the most difficult students I ever taught were the ones that were the pre-med, because pre-med were afraid of asking anything, but they also thought they knew it all. So that's a tough one. Those are the ones that I had the best stupid questions from. I don't know anything about extraction. Welcome to the world. But that's also another reason to be here, as well as qualitative and quantitative chemistry that sounds very exciting and very difficult, but we're going to make sure that it's not that difficult. What is the best extraction? We'll answer that one too. So I have a few things to help on that, on what the best extraction is, as well as when you're looking at extraction, when you're doing sample preparation for doing a qualitative, that is extraction. How do I get to know more about extraction without doing any work? That ain't happening. This is what every single plan looks like in the hemp industry. You have this beautiful bike ride. It's almost a little bit of downhill forever. And it's a straight road. And every time it's whether extraction and put into my product, and so you're making sure that you can actually have something, but it's the same thing when you're doing qualitative chemistry. Just give me a list of pesticides that are allowable, and then give me a result that I like, and I need a lab to give me the answer I need. So you really want a lab that's going to give you the right answer based on the sample you gave it, rather than having something that's skewed. And reality looks more towards this cartoon, and that is there's lots of things that happen, and somewhere along the middle, when you look at the cartoon, the miracle occurs. And that is exactly what happens. Decisions are based on data-driven business plan. And so you want to have the data. You want to be able to know what the reality is, or you're going to go out of business very quickly. And evolving as a business, and the business climate evolves at times to take a pivot where you're moving and what you want to do, and also evolving as the scientific process resolves and regulations increase. Being prepared for the future, not being prepared for the past. So it's the same thing as where do you play hockey? You go where the puck is, not where it's going to be. You want to go where the puck is going to be, not where it is. So this is what you need for testing all the way through these processes, that if you're in here, these are the parts that are needed. Quality and assurance, exploring the seed genetics. Did you get the right seeds? The plant, the leaves, and the flowers, the growing and the extraction process, but also you want to make sure that if you're in a hemp farm, you're making sure that you're walking the fields to be able to look for plants that look a little different, and it may be that they're different because they've gotten the wrong seeds. You could have an auto flower in the midst of another field, so you want to make sure everything is okay and that they're all matching the criteria that you want. The extraction process is critical based even on what you're growing, the shelf life of the products, the potency of the key components in that process, the determination of all the contaminants, whether the contaminants that the state wants or you're trying to regulate, all those contaminants are possible to be in there, including ones that are brought in. So you can have E. coli by someone not washing their hands and then touching the instruments and then touching the products. That didn't come from the genetics or the plant or the extraction. It came from an outside source. Internal R&D for fast enhancements of processes. If you're doing something and you're cooking oatmeal, you're not waiting to get an answer from a laboratory 2 weeks later on what you're trying to cook for oatmeal. And the same thing is happening here. A lot of people say, well, I just want to send out the lab, I'll get it back in a couple weeks, but you can't make process controls with 2 weeks in between different things that you're trying. Not only that, but you also want to hold your IP close. So you want to be able to make sure that what you're doing, you're changing yourself. The other one is the alternative to higher investments. It's not so much an investment and such. You can really move that needle over and justify some very simple testing that most people don't realize is available. So when you look at an extraction system, a lot of people think it's only concentrating what they're caring about. The plant doesn't care what you're caring about, whether it's CBDA or THCA. It does not care what you're caring about. It's going to extract everything that comes with the solubility of the solvent that you're using or the process that you're using. And this is more of what that world looks like. It's not a quick bike ride. It's more of a mountain bike down a hill with lots of curves and cliffs to go over. There's places that you have to figure out and make changes. There's a curve, and you got to figure out how to be able to get a bridge and make a bridge. You got to figure out how to make a tram. You got to figure out how to cross on a boat over a bridge. Each one of these facets is what's going to bring you the satisfaction of getting to the end, but it's never going to be as simple as what it looks like when you first start. These are two principles that you really need to be thinking about, the economics as well as the science. So when you're looking at the economics and looking at contaminants, you're looking at active ingredients, mold, adulterants, pesticides, they're all going to be coming over based on what you're doing for an extraction style. But then you also look at the business, it's the investment, it's the dollars to buy the equipment, the dollars to buy the raw material, utilities, human resources, service, dollars per gram of purchase and dollars per gram to sell, and the facility and the cost of facility. And I put the two adulterants in HR in red just because I could. So over the years, extraction has evolved. And as you're moving through the entire process, you go back through and you know that as you're moving through, extraction has gotten less and less painful. Extraction has been able to go through, and now we have dentists. We're not actually putting our foot on people's shoulders and pulling out teeth. We also know that even with that, it's still painful, and it is still painful no matter how many good sections we have or what we have for different parts of technology and more machines and more automation. It's still difficult. So I use it as a pause, but I got into an elevator in Las Vegas, and there was a man on the elevator. And so when I entered the elevator, it was probably the 23rd, 24th floor, I don't remember exactly. And as we moved down the elevator, it was just the two of us in the elevator, and I was facing more towards the door, and he was a little bit behind me. And as I moved through that elevator, and the elevator went down to maybe it's the 15th floor or something like that, and the doors open, nobody gets in, the doors shut. We moved down a little bit further. Probably it was the 5th floor or something like that, and the doors open, and the doors close. Nobody gets in. We get down towards the bottom, towards that, and the man, I could hear it. He says, that was odd. And so I didn't turn around, and I said, not if you can see dead people. And so he didn't say anything, he didn't laugh, and so as we got to the bottom, he says, well, did they get on? I says, no, they got off. And so it's all those hidden things that you think that everything is so complicated, but as you believe more and more people, you're really believing, am I really seeing dead people? No, I cannot see dead people. But the man on the elevator, he doesn't know. And so as you're moving through the process, you want to be able to ask people. You want to be able to know, can you have an expert that comes in and helps you out? Do they see dead people, or are they just making stuff up? So we leave a little bit of a time for people to know what they have and what they want to get out of the session. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll give you a chance to write those down. Welcome back. A couple good questions as far as what we're doing and how we're doing it. But the biggest question has been, how do you differentiate between cannabis and hemp? And there is no distinction, except for the regulatory laws that have been put in place that say that it has to be 0.3%. Those are the same sort of regulatory laws that we talk about when we're talking about milk. And we're talking about low-fat milk and whole milk and skim milk, where now you have reduced fat milk and used to be 2% milk and such. The same thing happens with coffee. We talk about caffeinated coffee, and we talk about decaffeinated coffee, and we talk about those different processes in place, but those are regulatory laws. So I once did the following, because I'm male, and that is I stood in front of the dairy section, and I was curious about people's reaction on what they knew about milk. And so I stood there, and then eventually some other people would come up, and I would stare at the dairy case and kind of fold my arms and say, I just don't get it. And they would say, what don't you get? I says, what's 2% milk? I mean, how do they make 2% milk? And it was a lot of the interesting answers that I would get. And so some people would just like, oh, I don't know. And they would walk away. And other people would try and explain it, or they'd think about it for the first time because they hadn't thought about it so much. They just went in there and reached in for the milk that they wanted. But there are regulatory laws on what the percentages of milk are, and even whole milk. And how do you mix the milk so that you get to that percentage? So that's important when you're looking at the overall process. When people talk about decaffeinated coffee and the regulations is still, you still have caffeine in there. It's just that it has to be below a certain level. And so now you're doing the same thing with hemp. Hemp is cannabis. It's just that it's below a certain level for one compound that the government is interested in regulating. When I look at these teas, so I have one tea, and how do you know the difference between a caffeinated tea and one that's not? So I have to read the label, and I have to believe what's in that label. So I have, chamomile tea, and it says it's naturally caffeine-free in 3 different languages. And this one here is the English breakfast tea, and it has caffeine in it. But if I was to take these out and I mix them up, would I know the difference? And I could say, well, maybe I can smell the difference, probably. So I also have those. And the other part that I see a lot of times is we talk about, well, how do I have cannabis into a natural product? And this is a fish oil. Tells me how many milligrams of EPA, DHA, omega-3, and omega-6 are in them. But it's not as though where I bought it from has a bunch of krill out in the back, and then they're extracting it themselves. I have the difference between a krill oil, which is different from the fish oil. So now I have omega-3 and extracts and some other components in here, and tells me how much is in there. But no one is, again, no one's got a bunch of krill out in the back. I look at Super B vitamin complex, supports cellular. But as I look at these, one of the things that's interesting to me is that a lot of people say, well, the FDA hasn't applied it to cannabis, and why do I have to have all these things on it? So I look at this one. This is D3. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any diseases. This is B. And on here, it goes back through some of the same type of supplements. Some supplements may interact with certain medications, interfere. So again, you have a lot of warnings on each one of these compounds, on these products. And that's the same thing that you're having with the hemp. There's nothing wrong with having those processes in place. I have the same thing here with 2 different types of coffee. I have a decaffeinated and a caffeinated coffee. So this is going to be a lot harder than the tea, because I can smell the chamomile versus the other one. Each one of these processes in place tells you that you need to know what those numbers are, but you also have to be responsible. These plants here are less than 0.3% THC, THCA as a potential. But they don't look any different, and they definitely don't smell any different than if you went to a cannabis field. So when people ask me for what's the best concentration in a process for natural plants, I've made up this one. So I like to say that it's the botanical materials integrity maintained to assure that the concentration of the desired components are in their natural form. You want to be able to make sure that you haven't harmed the plant, no matter what type of plant it is, lavender or any other echinacea. You want to make sure that the components that you want in the final formulation are still there. E is for effective concentration with efficacy, efficiency, and economics with predefined boundaries. That should be predefined, not redefined, but maybe that's the US government one. So if I go back through, you're looking at that entire process, and you want to make sure that you're able to have efficacy. So it has to be safe. It has to be for what you want it to be in, the components. And so the other one is once you have that, you want to have efficiency in economics, because you want to stay in business and continue to provide those products for your customer. Safety is critical. So the safety of everyone throughout the process, as OSHA becomes involved, and as you're looking at through those processes, this still has involved in testing because you're wanting to make sure that your airflow is the correct. You want to make sure that your employees are wearing safety glasses, that there's eye washes. All those things come into play with this process. And T is for testing with modern technology advances in every facet. So that's what we're talking about today, is how does the testing affect each one of these above? And it's totally involved with each one. There's a couple series that we have up there. This is Dr. King. We have a series up in Emerald Scientific Community, but we also have one through terpenes and testing. So we have a few other training videos that are well worth the time. And these will tell you where the testing comes into play in each one of those and with more detail. Another process that I like to look at, and that is moving through this kind of blue, green, call it a yellow and an orange. And that is the pre-processing is important. You move to the pre-processing, so you take the flowers, you're going to want to test the flowers, you grind the flowers, then you're going to want to test that. Then you decarboxylate, you're going to test that. You have the decarboxylated material, you go through any type of extraction, pick an extraction that you want to do, test it again before and after. On each one of these stages, that's where testing has to happen so that you're making sure that you have the efficiency of the process, and so you also want to make sure that you're getting the right compounds out at the right time. There's three things that I talked about. Remember the 4 S's. So one is speed, one is scale, and one is selectivity. So when I talk about speed, I talk about the entire cycle time, not just the extraction, no matter what means it is. It's the entire cycle time from the time you put sample in until the time you again put it out, another sample into that container. That's a cycle. So there's a lot of times you'll look at different things like ethanol versus CO2. CO2 can be a little bit slower, but you're not having as many steps in between. So it's the entire cycle time that you want to look when you're testing, and that's where you want to know your results. Scale means that you're trying to have something that's scalable depending on how big you're trying to get and how small you're trying to get. It's appropriately size. You don't need an 18-wheeler to go to the store and back. You're not bringing that many groceries, right? But at the same time, you're not wanting a 2-seater to bring the family of 6 on camping trip. You want to have the right size of material, but also if you got the 2-seater and now you have one for one type of trip, and then you move and you start to have children, now you get the next size. Now you get yourself a 4-door, and after that, then you get yourself a minivan, and if you have too many children, then you are going to have to get the 18-wheeler. The other one is selectivity. So when you look at selectivity, I think specifically of how selective can I be and what do I want to get out of each one of those processes. So speed, scale, selectivity, and the rule of thumb is pick 2. You don't get all 3. You only get 2. You're either going to get speed and scale, or you're going to get selectivity and scale, or you're going to get selectivity and speed. But each one of those, you're going to have a different criteria because you're not going to get all 3. When we look at that, we're also thinking about how you're staying in business. There's only 3 ways to make money. You can increase revenue, you can decrease cost, or you can optimize asset utilization. Those are the 3 ways to make money. And no matter what kind of process you have, those are the things to think about and how you're making a decision. But to be able to make that decision, you need hard data to know what you're actually trying to get. And that's a spreadsheet that's quite long. But to do all that work up front will save you a lot of time savings and not losing money on the backside. Remembering that you have all these compounds. It's not just 1 or 2 compounds. I bring up the slide again because there's so many of them. There's hundreds of compounds. Which are the most important for what you're trying to do? So when you look at the data integrity and you look at this slide where I sort of bunch up some of the slides, compounds together. So what happens is there's so many compounds. That's true. But you have families of compounds too. You have cannabinoids, which are very similar to each other. You have terpenes that are more similar to each other. You have lipids and you have waxes that are more similar. So you actually have families of compounds. And that's what this shows here. is you have sesquiterpenes and terpenes and cannabinoids, flavonoids, sugars. There's a lot of different things that you have in that sample, but some of them are families, so you can bunch them together. So this is what actually where the material is, and some of the talks that you see here at the conference speak to where you have the biosynthesis of the cannabinoids, for example, and the terpenes. So if you look at these three different ones, you have the bulbous trichomes, the capitate sessile trichomes, and the capitate stalk trichomes. And those are the ones that you typically see in all the beautiful photos. The first ones are very, very small. There's not much in them. They're just another means of getting the biosynthesis. The capitate trichomes, they're like little spears, and so there's not much in those. And then you have the capitates, that's the one where you have a stalk, and you can see that there's a big bulb up on top. So those are where the cannabinoids are. Back in 1981, when they didn't have all this information because they were just learning more about the plant, then they were able to take this needle and pull it out and found out that sure enough there were cannabinoids in there. And then you move to the next stage. Well, this is a paper that came out in April of 2020, I believe. And so from there you can see that they started to move to the next part, and that is how are they synthesized. So now they're using a needle and they're finding out the synthases that allow the different products to make genetically the different cannabinoids. And again, speaking of that, you still go back to the CBGA. So they move from the CBGA of knowing what was in there to now the synthases that actually make those. So the research is now happening on the agricultural side, and the research is now happening on the cannabinoid side, on the body's reaction to those. And both of these are now coming into more and more specific testing, but you don't need as much specific testing, but you have to be aware of the research that's being done to help you out, whether it's growing or whether it's extracting or whether it's making formulated products. So when you look at that, the easiest thing for me to do is speak to you about the least expensive technology for you to do a test, and it's called thin layer chromatography. And what it really is it's very similar to making tie-dye shirts. So if you make a tie-dye shirt and you have different colors will move through the cotton at different rates because the cotton has water in it, and it has a different retention value for the green, the yellow, the blue, and that's why you'll see the pattern of a circle of color. And that's what actually thin layer chromatography is. It's just that it's made on a different dimension and you're using a different solvent and you're trying to have different compounds. So when you look at that, it's actually like a piece of paper, like paper chromatography, or this is thin layer, which happens to use a different backside. But you start off by having a piece of silica, and you draw a line across, and you take a small amount of the material, and you make a droplet. And then what happens here is as you're going through that, and the solvent moves past this, just like a tie-dye shirt, it starts to move up, and the further it moves up, because of the difference in the chemistry, the same way with your blue versus red on your tie-dye, one's moving faster than another. And then what happens is when it reaches the end, you can measure where those peaks go, and they're always going to go at the same rate, because the blue and the red, they're always going to be at the same rate. So when I'm looking at that, now this is a real, this is a product out of Oregon that you can use. So this is THC, and you can see that the THC only moves this far. But if you look across the others, you can tell different products and where they come out, and you can see that this is THC, 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 so it's a fiber-like, there's not as much. You can see over here that CBDA only moves this high, but it's higher than this one, so it's differentiated, and you can see which products have CBDA. And the same thing with the other compounds. So the analogy up front and the one down here where you actually can test your own product, that's going to help you. You're going to be able to know very quickly what's in your compound, no matter whether it's the leaf or whether it's a final formulated product. When you look at that and you look at what people talk about with column chromatography, you now have a column that's packed, and you have a solvent that you've already placed in there, and versus having a dot, you actually put a layer of material on the top of that, and it will do the exact same thing. So there's your blue, red, green. They're coming off at different times. They travel at different rates. So just like when you're doing the capillary action up a thin layer chromatography where they're moving along with the solvent, the same thing happens here, except it's going in the opposite direction, and you're able to collect them. That's what the chromatography does. So now when you're actually taking that and utilizing it, you can see, remember when we looked at that first chromatogram way in the beginning of the presentation, that is what this is showing. So this is the amount, and this is time. And this compound, here's a CBDA, it will always come out at the exact same time. So now that's what you're doing when you're sending it to a lab result, but something you can simply do with thin layer chromatography. They're always going to come out at the exact same time. And the amount of material will show you the height of that band and how much is selected in each one of those bands. And that's what it works. So when you're going to a laboratory and you're trying to get results back and they send you back a certificate of analysis and they're showing that, that's the exact same thing that they're doing. So again, remember we talked about standards. So these are standards. These are pure compounds that are all added in, so they know exactly how much is in each one of those. This is a real sample, so you can see in the real sample, it doesn't have that same amount. Each one is a variable amount based on what that plant has. And that's the key to all of the testing. So whether you're doing thin layer chromatography or you're doing column chromatography, whether it's gas or whether it's liquid, you're still doing the same process, and that's what your laboratories are doing. So now if you correlate these, this is one that I ran probably in 2015 or so. Not the greatest chromatography, I didn't do the greatest job, but you can see that exactly, I had 3 different compounds and you can see they're different. And that's the one that we saw before that had the standards, and in between you can see what the chromatography looks like. So this one only has one, so it has a 1, 2, 3, you can see here 4, 5, you can start to see the smaller amounts, like these would be a smaller amount, and this is a larger amount. You can see exactly where those components are. And that gives you a very simple test, and it's well under $300, and certainly not so much per test, so you can do it every single day in your kitchen. Remembering that as we're working through the process, that THC is not something that the plant makes, it's a degradation product, so this is THCA, going to THC with the CO2, and then you have oxidative degradation, it goes to CBN. So CBN is not something the plant makes, it's a degradation product from THC. So how does that look when I have a mixture? So remember we talked about standards, everything was pure. So this is a pure UV spectra. So what a UV spectra is, it measures the amount of intensity of light that's absorbed. When I have that, I just have the THC, but when I have THC plus CBN, so it's a 8-to-1 ratio, and so you see here that it looks very similar. So it'll be very difficult to change these two, but you can see this part of the UV spectra is very different. So when you're looking at those two things and moving towards, this is a thin layer chromatography, but they look at the density of the peak, and so it turns into more looking like a chromatogram, but it's a densigram. And so same thing here. Here's your delta 9, here's your THCV, here's your CBG, and you can tell very quickly at this concentration versus the one here, I think this, it's a 20-to-1 dilution. So now if you dilute this, you don't see the other components because they're too diluted to be able to show up on a thin layer chromatography. And that's typically what happens is anything under 2% of a compound will not show up on a thin layer chromatography. So that's one downgrade. You're not going to be able to tell if you have the 0.3 because it only goes to 2%. And that's why. It's because of the concentration. There's other technology. These are some of the technologies I use. I use a light lab. It's a small mobile chromatography unit. It gives me the same thing. I can travel all across the world with it. It goes through all the different airport because it's just a testing equipment. I don't have anything in there that they're going to want. But it does give me a quick answer on everything I want for a health check, and I just Take it everywhere I go. This is the type of results you get on some of the original work. So here's some work that I did. It's 9.4% THCA and THC. So for a customer that was making that, and this one over here is obviously a CBD isolate, or not isolate, distillation. So it's 82.5% CBD, but you can also see that it has no THCA and THC. So it gives you a quick indication and can certainly go down to 0.3%. 0.03%, so 10 times less than what the government standards are. Let's talk about extraction, because extraction is what you're doing when you're doing any quantitative work. So the way so now you have a cell, and you have a cell wall that you have a solvent that goes through, so that's what every laboratory is doing. They're going through a cell, and from there they're able to have A and B. So my A and B are the two things that I want to take out of this cell. It goes through the cell wall, it grabs these, it comes back out to the cell wall, and with the solvent it goes to the surface, and then from the surface it's swept into the solvent. So when you take a sample and you take a hemp flower and you put chloroform in it, or hexane or ethanol, for example, and you shake it up, and that's what it's actually doing. It's actually pulling the material out of each cell, and that's how you're doing a sample prep. The thing is that columns, samples are not circles. They look more like this, and they're all a different size, and you have A and B, and everything's different because you ground it up. And what you really look at is rather than one, so now you have, I'm looking at flow number 1, it goes over here, and it goes over to there, and it gets stuck in here, but it doesn't, and then it passes over the cell wall, and it goes to the cell wall, and then it comes back out of the cell wall, and then now it's back into the solvent, and it moves along, and then it moves number 5, and it moves down down to the next cell. And so through the process, but that's what you're doing. So when you're looking at all these different grind out samples, they're not round, but it doesn't make it any more complex. But if you have a very large one, now you're going to have a long time for that material to get through. And that's why you grind it up, so that you get a greater surface area with all those compounds. So if you were to just take a hemp bud, throw it into ethanol, and just shake it up for the same amount of time that if you pre-ground it, just like they do in the laboratories, you'll find that it will take a long time. You're not going to get the same number. But that's also the point of lots of the cells. So we just looked at a small amount, but then you figure you have a very large sample size, and that's what you're going to have in a laboratory, but also what you want to be testing yourself. Every time you walk through that entire transport, it's whether it's extraction or whether it's no matter how you're extracting, because you're going to want to test the material before and test the material afterwards to know if you got all the material out of there. You don't want to be leaving CBDA inside your hemp media. Every single extraction, of course, when you're grinding, there's a certain, it's much faster in the beginning, the same way that you do even with a small test tube, because a lot of the material may have been broken up, and you burst the trichomes when you were grinding. So if you're trying to make and keep the trichomes intact, then you don't want to be grinding, because you want to take the material and try and shake it up into something cold so that those trichomes fall off the stalk, but they're still in their form. And so you want to keep those trichomes together, not break them up. When you're doing grinding, it will break them up, and so that first part of the extraction. But that's why when you're looking at that first part and you only shake it up for a little bit, what happens there is that you're not going to get the full sample out of that. So that's why it takes, sometimes people are putting in an hour to be able to get all the material out, because it looks like it's fast, but that isn't the case. On the side of the chemistry, it takes longer during that last part if you really want to get a true answer. So if you have coffee and you're extracting coffee, that's exactly what you're doing. Is you're taking hot water and you're extracting caffeine out of the coffee. And it's because you're looking for the coffee, but you're also looking for the flavors, and that's why there's a difference between cold brew and hot brew. When you have cold brew coffee, you get about 1,000 compounds. When you have hot brew coffee, you get about 1,500 compounds. But as you well know, The cold brew takes, a long time. It's probably 18 hours, 12 hours to get a good cup of cold brew. But the cold brew will last a very long time where, you have a little more acidic flavor out of the coffee. So when I talk about solvents, I talk about all the different solvents that can be done in extraction, but it's also all the same solvents that can be done on a very small scale. And that's how you learn about each one and what's the best technology for you. So when I'm seeing each part of the extraction, it really is the red and blue balls that allow you to have a lot of peaks. Remember, we looked at the TLC, and we remember that this is the absorbance and this is time. And you can see there's a lot of peaks. Doesn't matter what they are, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of the balls. And now you do an extraction, so now you've taken away some of those balls because you've separated some, same as the coffee. You're not getting the coffee grounds in your coffee cup, hopefully, they're all left behind. That's the same thing that's happening here, so now you have less. And then you talk about purification and people talk about isolate. What you're really doing is you're making a single molecule. That's a pictorial based on the same way that you would be doing an extraction and doing an extraction by having a higher and higher temperature. This happens to be a CO2 extraction, and you're setting up the different phases. So here you could either increase your pressure and having the temperature constant, and you can see what you're going to have for different separations, or you can do it a separate way and you can have the temperature constant but then change your pressure. So each one of these provides you a different type of extraction, but it also gives you a different type of compounds that are out that you're extracting. So now you want to know what those are, and you want to be able to know which is the best type of extraction, what's the best pressure that you would be getting for what you need for a formulation. And then you have things without solvent. So things without solvent are like a cold water hash of even the hemp and such, and that is taking things that are very cold and then having them fall off. So the same thing with doing paper or some sort of filtration, the same thing you do with a little bit of your coffee is that you're holding back those grounds so that they're not falling through. That's the piece of paper, that's the filter that you have in, that's a separation. So when I have the candy down here in the picture, I can see that that's a separation where I want to separate those pieces based on size or based on color or something, but I'm separating them mechanically. That's a separation. But when I'm making the coffee, that's an extraction because I'm using a liquid to a solid, I'm using water, and I'm using the temperature of the water. So remembering it's the size of the particle, remembering it's the temperature, remembering it's the media that's being used, as well as the location of the compounds of interest. So each one of these, when you're doing a sample and doing qualitative, the qualitative part and quantitative part of your test is critical to this. So now you have extraction and you have separation. And what I like to do is put the words together. So I made up a word called separaction. So a separaction is where I'm actually doing a separation first and then I'm doing an extraction. So when I'm doing winterization and I put it into the fridge and therefore the solid goes through and I'm separating, that's a separation, and then I do an extraction when I pull off the ethanol. Same thing happens with hybrids where you're able to do the same type of thing, but you're able to match them together. And so what you're trying to do is with a solvent and without a solvent, matching them together to be able to get as fast an extraction as possible using both processes. So things like that are pre-extraction, microwave, ultrasonic, pulse electric field, modulated cavitation, cold pressing, trichomes. And then post-processing, you're doing it in line with centrifuges and tricanting and also inline filtration. So you have a lot of things that are available already today, and you can use these same things when you're doing and trying to get small amounts of sample that you're wanting to quantitate. So what we want to do now is look at a couple of examples of how the testing matters when you're looking through different parts of the process. So we talked about thin layer chromatography, we talked about liquid chromatography, we talked about some of the mobile work that's done there with things like a mobile unit like a light lab, for example, that we saw the orange box. There's other technology that allows you to look at infrared and those things can be done very quickly. The other process that we want to see is how you apply it and why it makes sense. So I want to look at two examples. The first one is looking at the decarboxylation process. So in this experiment, what we're looking at is taking biomass, whether hemp or whether cannabis with the high THC, and that is drying it for a certain amount of times and then stopping the process and taking samples and then measuring those samples to know what is the percentage of CBD, THC, or any of the other cannabinoids as far as the removal of the carboxylic acid group, so you're decarboxylating. When you look at this study here, you see the starting material, in this case, had 5.2% THCA and 4.6% THC and about 1.4% CBD. Now the CBD in this case had already been decarboxylated. So even though it talks about the CBD, the same thing is going to be true with a CBDA experiment. The first part of the experiment after 2 hours showed that your THCA was 15.2 and your THC was 7.6 and CBD was 1.7. So what you're not expecting is during that process time that those percentages would go up. If you look at 2.5 hours, you see it's 13%, and then after 3 hours, greater than 3 hours, it's hardly anything. So when you, zero. And so if you look at that, but you look at the THC, now you see the THC number going up to 6.2 and 7.2. When you look at the CBD number, you can see that it's fairly constant. What this tells you is there's a couple ways to interpret that data, because at first you think, well, why would the percentage be going up? I look at the top graph, and on the top graph, I'm taking the total potential THC into effect. So that's taking the THCA number times 0.877 and then adding the THC number, so that gives me to my 9.5, and you can see it decreases. Now there's a couple things that can happen. If you assume that the weight is constant and you calculate the potential amount of THC, then if you had 1,643 grams, you initially started off with 156 grams, and then you can see that it was reduced in 3 hours down to 117 grams. So that would assume that 39 grams of THC was lost in the conversion of THCA to THC, as well as further degradation, whether it's CBN or some other product. But if you take the second assumption and realize that there's other material in there, and you assume that the initial loss was due to moisture, then by the time you're at the end, you can see that your initial of 1,643, you're really coming out with 415 grams of water. So that's not unusual. So when you start to do a decarboxylation and you do it by weight and you're seeing what the different changes are, the first part of the change is going to be the fact that the water is going to be evaporated. And so you can have data that you hadn't expected to have a loss when that doesn't make any sense, but there's no way for you to have known that that effect happens. The next effect happens is you can start to do more of these studies that allow you to look at, does water make a difference? Is it doing something else besides just the processing? Is there another way of getting rid of the water up front so that you're able to really optimize the entire process and not have the water included? Is there too much moisture in the room? Is there other things that can contribute to that? Because you're also not wanting water in your product because you can have other mold or other things that can happen because of too much water. So when you look at measurement before and after decarboxylation, you have the material that you can see here where I've had the orange and the gray and knowing what the potential THC is. And you can see that that's going down, but it hasn't really gone down when you start to think about whether you were having moisture involved. The second easy study to look at, no matter what kind of extraction you're doing, but what kind of process, this is an experiment where it took a vessel and put the material into the vessel and then extracted it from there, and then from that being able to take the vessel itself and push it out. So you can see from the cylinder number 1, the configuration I had it in, it was going from the bottom to the top in CO2 extraction, and the CO2 was working from the bottom to the top. I took the vessel after I'd gotten it out, and then I moved it sideways, and that's why you see it as a sideways, but it really is the right-hand side is the top, and the bottom, the left side is the bottom. And you can see already a difference in the color is fairly obvious. But the other part that is not as obvious, that if you take a cut through the middle of this vessel, in this picture, you can see that even a cut across it, you can see that there's dark and light. And this gives you an opportunity to look at, is there channeling? Is there things that allow the CO2 to go through where it's not getting to all of the biomass? And there's no way to know this without really having the analytical tool that you have at your disposal, whether it's thin layer chromatography or if it's a gamma cert, for example, that would do powder, ground up material. You're not going to know that unless you've gone through the study. Now, it's one thing to have an intellectual study and know that you have a change, but let's look at the real repercussions of not having an analytical tool at your disposal in-house. If I look at this diagram here, I have a pressure vessel that shows the outside of that. I have 9 different segments, so it's loaded from the bottom with biomass, and then on top marbles, and then you see the top part of the extraction vessel. If I'm looking at those same numbers that we see there on the left-hand side with the difference in color, I've measured 9 different places within that. So across the bottom, you can see that, like the picture shows, that it has been extracted, and there's not much left. It says 0, but maybe it's a little above 0. And then you can see the next row of numbers, the 1.8, the 3.0, and the 10.5, and you think, well, why is there a difference there? Well, you can see that it hasn't extracted all of it, but even in the center it has. But it's starting to bypass the material on the right-hand side. And then you see the top where you can tell that 10.2, 13.2, and 11.4, that had not extracted that material. So in essence, what you've done is you've wasted some of the time. The material has not been completed. You might have thought that there was enough time, but it hasn't been enough time. As you look at that material and you start to put in the amount of weight that also was in each one of those 9 segments, and then you start to take the weight and then you figure out how much material that material at that time cost. It's not the same as it was today. This is 3 years ago, a different world. And you can see that you weren't losing any dollars across the bottom, but you're losing $300 across the left side and $2,000 almost on the right-hand side, and then across the top, you're losing close to an average of $2,000. So within that process, and if you were to find this out, knowing that you were losing that much money even from this one batch, and you start to have the batches that maybe you had not done before, you now see that you've lost a significant amount of money that you certainly could gain with just one purchase of an instrument, or at least even on the side, because that's, we'll call it 6 plus 2, 8. So you're close to $9,000 in loss every time that you're running. So for the $9,000, you'd be able to have a tool that allows you to know what the process is, when are you done, and then hone in the process. When you look at that, and then you go back through and you make some changes, this is the same sort of thing that we did, is we did make some changes on the process side, and now you can see 1.8, 1.5, 1.7, and you can tell that the percentage again, is showing you 0 and 1.0. It shows you that very quickly you've gained all that money back where you were losing it before. So as we started out the process day, we were talking about how to extract the best from every day and remembering what we had for best. And best was, the botanical extraction. E was for effective and efficacy, and for economics. S is for safety, and T is for testing with modern equipment. Really can make a very quick difference in your entire process. And so it is the concentration, the mixture, and the separation steps. It is a matter of looking at the 4 S's where you talk about selectivity, scale, and speed, but then also looking at the investment price that you're putting into it. And remembering that the goal of this is good is not a number. You're able to make real decisive changes in a very quick amount of time with very little investment. It certainly is the capital investment up front, but you're losing those operation expenses that could justify that expense. And perfection is the enemy of good. Being able to make sure that you're just getting what you need. You don't need the highest quality, brand new, spick and span system of the system we saw way in the beginning with UPLC and mass spectrometers and the bungee cord of the PhD to that instrument. You really need enough material to be able to decide that you're either your spot on your thin layer chromatography is there or it's not there. So you can take that deep red spot from the starting material, put another bit of material next to it, and then do a thin layer chromatography and see if there's a change in what you're getting for compounds coming out. So everything that we talked about, it looks like it's every single business plan, the road is wonderful, everything is perfect. The reality is there's going to be bumps in the road. The reality is that you need to have a window into that. So when you look at all these things and you think, well, that's a lot of work. But at the same time, you're doing the same thing where you spent more money monitoring your heart and going through and looking at where you ran. The second one is, would you drive your car without a speedometer? Would you drive your car without, a gas gauge? Because that's what you're doing, is if you don't have any testing, then what you've done is you're not monitoring anything. And on a car, when you run out of gas, you don't know it unless you actually have a way of measuring it. And that's what you're doing. You're really measuring how much gas is in your tank. So on all those different processes, I thank you for your time and appreciate the time to be able to discuss analytical testing and how it can make a difference in your laboratory. Have a great day.